Chapter 4, Society, Exchange, and the Division of Labor. Human Action. Number 1, Autistic Exchange and Interpersonal Exchange. Action always is essentially the exchange of one state of affairs for another state of affairs. If the action is performed by an individual without any reference to cooperation with other individuals, we may call it autistic exchange. An instance: the isolated hunter who kills an animal for his own consumption. He exchanges leisure and a cartridge for food. Within society, cooperation substitutes interpersonal or social exchange for autistic exchanges. Man gives to other men in order to receive from them. Mutuality emerges. Man serves in order to be served. The exchange relation is the fundamental social relation. Interpersonal exchange of goods and services weaves the bond which unites men into society. The societal formula is do a day. Where there is no intentional mutuality, where an action is performed without any design of being benefited by a concomitant action of other men, there is no interpersonal exchange but autistic exchange. It does not matter whether the autistic action is beneficial or detrimental to other people, or whether it does not concern them at all. A genius may perform his task for himself, not for the crowd. However, he is an outstanding benefactor of mankind. The robber kills the victim for his own advantage. The murdered man is by no means a partner in his crime. He is merely its object. What is done against him. Hostile aggression was a practice common to man's non-human forebears. Conscious and purposeful cooperation is the outcome of a long evolutionary process. Ethnology and history have provided us with interesting information concerning the beginning and the primitive patterns of interpersonal exchange. Some consider the custom of mutual giving and returning of presents and stipulating a certain return present in advance as a precursory pattern of interpersonal exchange. Others consider dumb barter as the primitive mode of trade. However, to make presents in the expectation of being rewarded by the receiver's return present, or in order to acquire the favor of a man whose animosity could be disastrous, is already tantamount to interpersonal exchange. The same applies to dumb barter, which is distinguished from other modes of bartering and trading only through the absence of oral discussion. It is the essential characteristics of the categories of human action that they are apodictic and absolute and do not admit of any gradation. There is action or non-action. There is exchange or non-exchange. Everything which applies to action and exchange as such is given or not given in every individual instance, according to whether there is or there is not action and exchange. In the same way, the boundaries between autistic exchange and interpersonal exchange are sharply distinct. Making one-sided presents without the aim of being rewarded by any conduct on the part of the receiver or of third persons is autistic exchange. The donor acquires the satisfaction which the better condition of the receiver gives to him. The receiver gets the present as a God-sent gift. But if presents are given in order to influence some people's conduct, they are no longer one-sided, but a variety of interpersonal exchange between the donor and the man whose conduct they are designed to influence. Although the emergence of interpersonal exchange was the result of a long evolution, no gradual transition is conceivable between autistic and interpersonal exchange. There were no intermediary modes of exchange between them. The step which leads from autistic to interpersonal exchange was no less a jump into something entirely new and essentially different than was the step from automatic reaction of the cells and nerves to conscious and purposeful behavior to action. Number 2, contractual bonds and hegemonic bonds. There are two different kinds of social cooperation: cooperation by virtue of contract and coordination, and cooperation by virtue of command and subordination or hegemony. Where and as far as cooperation is based on contract, the logical relation between the cooperating individuals is symmetrical. They are all parties to interpersonal exchange contracts. John has the same relation to Tom as Tom has to John. Where and as far as cooperation is based on command and subordination, there is the man who commands, and there are those who obey his orders. The logical relation between these two classes of men is asymmetrical. There is a director and there are people under his care. The director alone chooses and directs. The others, the wards, are mere pawns in his actions. The power that calls into life and animates any social body is always ideological might, and the fact that makes an individual a member of any social compound is always his own conduct. This is no less valid with regard to a hegemonic societal bond. It is true people are as a rule born into the most important hegemonic bonds, into the family and into the state, and this was also the case with the hegemonic bonds of older days, slavery and serfdom, which disappeared in the realm of Western civilization. But no physical violence and compulsion can possibly force a man against his will to remain in the status of the ward of a hegemonic order. What violence or the threat of violence brings about is a state of affairs in which subjection as a rule is considered more desirable than rebellion. Faced with the choice between the consequences of obedience and of disobedience, the ward prefers the former and thus integrates himself into the hegemonic bond. Every new command places this choice before him again. In yielding again and again, he himself contributes his share to the continuous existence of the hegemonic societal bond. Even as a ward in such a system, he is an acting human being, i.e., being not simply yielding to blind impulses, but using his reason in choosing between alternatives. What differentiates the hegemonic bond from the contractual bond is the scope in which the choices of the individuals determine the course of events. As soon as a man has decided in favor of his subjection to a hegemonic system, he becomes within the margin of this system's activities and, for the time of his subjection, a pawn of the director's actions. Within the hegemonic societal bond, and as far as it directs its subordinates' conduct, only the director acts. The wards act only in choosing subordination. Having once chosen subordination, they no longer act for themselves, they are taken care of. In the frame of a contractual society, the individual members exchange definite quantities of goods and services of a definite quality. In choosing subjection in a hegemonic bond, a man neither gives nor receives anything that is definite. He integrates himself into a system in which he has to render indefinite services and will receive what the director is willing to assign to him. He is at the mercy of the director. The director alone is free to choose. Whether the director is an individual or an organized group of individuals, a directorate, and whether the director is a selfish maniacal tyrant or a benevolent paternal despot, is of no relevance for the structure of the whole system. The distinction between these two kinds of social cooperation is common to all theories of society. Ferguson described it as the contrast between warlike nations and commercial nations. St. Simon as the contrast between pugnacious nations and peaceful or industrial nations. Herbert Spencer as the contrast between societies of individual freedom and those of a militant structure. Sombart as the contrast between heroes and peddlers. The Marxians distinguish between the genteel organization of a fabulous state of primitive society and the eternal bliss of socialism on the one hand, and the unspeakable degradation of capitalism on the other hand. The Nazi philosophers distinguish the counterfeit system of bourgeois security from the heroic system of authoritarian Führertum. The valuation of both systems is different with the various sociologists, but they fully agree in the establishment of the contrast and no less in recognizing that no third principle is thinkable and feasible. Western civilization, as well as the civilization of the more advanced Eastern peoples, are achievements of men who have cooperated according to the pattern of contractual coordination. These civilizations, it is true, have adopted in some respects bonds of hegemonic structure. The state as an apparatus of compulsion and coercion is by necessity a hegemonic organization. So is the family and its household community. However, the characteristic feature of these civilizations is the contractual structure proper to the cooperation of the individual families. There once prevailed almost complete autarky and economic isolation of the individual household units. When interfamilial exchange of goods and services was substituted for each family's economic self-sufficiency, It was in all nations commonly considered civilized, a cooperation based on contract. Human civilization, as it has been hitherto known to historical experience, is preponderantly a product of contractual relations. Any kind of human cooperation and social mutuality is essentially an order of peace and conciliatory settlement of disputes. In the domestic relations of any societal unit, be it a contractual or a hegemonic bond, there must be peace. Where there are violent conflicts, and as far as there are such conflicts, there is neither cooperation nor societal bonds. Those political parties which, in their eagerness to substitute the hegemonic system for the contractual system, point at the rottenness of peace and of bourgeois security, extol the moral nobility of violence and bloodshed, and praise war and revolution as the eminently natural methods of interhuman relations, contradict themselves. For their own utopias are designed as realms of peace. The Reich of the Nazis and the Commonwealth of the Marxians are planned as societies of undisturbed peace. They are to be created by pacification, i.e. the violent subjection of all those not ready to yield without resistance. In a contractual world, various states can quietly coexist. In a hegemonic world, there can only be one Reich or Commonwealth and only one dictator. Socialism must choose between a renunciation of the advantages of division of labor, encompassing the whole earth and all peoples, and the establishment of a world-embracing hegemonic order. It is this fact that made Russian Bolshevism, German Nazism, and Italian fascism dynamic, i.e. aggressive. Under contractual conditions, empires are dissolved into a loose league of autonomous member nations. The hegemonic system is bound to strive after the annexation of all independent states. The contractual order of society is an order of right and law. It is a government under the rule of law, Rechtsstaat, as differentiated from the welfare state, Wohlfahrtsstaat, or paternal state. Right or law is the complex of rules determining the orbit in which individuals are free to act. No such orbit is left to wards of a hegemonic society. In the hegemonic state, there is neither right nor law. There are only directives and regulations which the director may change daily and apply with what discrimination he pleases, and which the wards must obey. The wards have one freedom only, to obey without asking questions. Socialism. Number 1. The nature of society. The idea of human destiny dominates all the more ancient views of social existence. Society progresses towards a goal foreordained by the deity. Whoever thinks in this way is logically correct if, in speaking of progress and retrogression, of revolution and counter-revolution, of action and reaction, he lays on these concepts the emphasis adopted by so many historians and politicians. History is judged according as it brings mankind nearer to the goal or carries it farther away. Social science, however, begins at the point where one frees oneself from such habits, and indeed from all valuation. Social science is indeed teleological in the sense in which every causal study of the will must be. But its concept of purpose is wholly compromised in the causal explanation. For social science, causality remains the fundamental principle of cognition, the maintenance of which must not be impaired even by teleology. Since it does not evaluate purposes, it cannot speak of evolution to a higher plane in the sense, let us say, of Hegel and Marx. For it is by no means proved that all evolution leads upwards, or that every later stage is a higher one. No more, of course, can it agree with the pessimistic philosophers of history, who see in the historical process a decline, a progressive approach to a bad end. To ask what are the driving forces of historical evolution is to ask what is the nature of society and the origin and causes of the changes in social conditions. What society is, how it originates, how it changes. These alone can be the problems which scientific sociology sets itself. That the social life of men resembles the biological process is an observation of ancient date. It lies at the basis of the famous legend of Menenius Agrippa, handed down to us by Livy. Social science did itself little good, When inspired by the triumph of biology in the 19th century, voluminous works developed this analogy to the point of absurdity. What is the use of calling the products of human activity social intercellular substance? Who was enlightened when scholars disputed which organ of the social body corresponded to the central nervous system? The best comment on this form of sociological study was the remark of an economist, to the effect that anyone who compared money with blood and the circulation of money with the circulation of blood would be making the same contribution to economics as would be made to biology by a man who compared blood with money and the blood circulation with the circulation of money. Modern biology has borrowed from social science some of its most important concepts, that of evolution, of the division of labor, and of the struggle for existence. But it has not stopped short at metaphorical phrases and conclusions by analogy. Rather has it proceeded to make profitable use of what it had gained. On the other hand, biological sociology did nothing but play a futile word-spinning game with the ideas it borrowed back. The Romantic movement, with its organic theory of the state, has done even less to clear up our knowledge of social interrelations. Because it deliberately cold-shouldered the most important achievement of social science up to that date, the system of classical political economy, it was unable to utilize the doctrine of the division of labor. That part of the classical system which must be the starting point of all sociology, as it is of modern biology. Comparison with a biological organism should have taught sociology one thing, that the organism can only be conceived as a system of organs. This, however, merely means that the essence of the organism is the division of labor. Only division of labor makes the parts become members. It is in the collaboration of the members that we recognize the unity of the system, the organism. This is true of the life of plants and animals as well as of society. As far as the principle of the division of labor is concerned, the social body may be compared with a biological. The division of labor is the tertium comparationis, basis for comparison, of the old simile. The division of labor is a fundamental principle of all forms of life. It was first detected in the sphere of social life when political economists emphasized the meaning of the division of labor in the social economy. Biology then adopted it, at the instigation in the first place of Milne Edwards in 1827. The fact that we can regard the division of labor as a general law must not, however, prevent us from recognizing the fundamental differences between division of labor in the animal and vegetable organism on the one hand, and division of labor in the social life of human beings on the other. Whatever we imagine to be the origin, evolution, and meaning of the physiological division of labor, it clearly does not shed any light on the nature of the sociological division of labor. The process that differentiates and integrates homogeneous cells is completely different from that which led to the growth of human society out of self-sufficient individuals. In the second process, reason and will play their part in the coalescence, by which the previously independent units form a larger unit and become parts of a whole, whereas the intervention of such forces in the first process is inconceivable. Even where creatures, such as ants and bees, come together in animal communities, all movements and change take place instinctively and unconsciously. Instinct may very well have operated at the beginning and in the earliest stages of social formation also. Man is already a member of a social body when he appears as a thinking, willing creature, for the thinking man is inconceivable as a solitary individual. Only amongst men does man become a man, ficta. The development of human reason and the development of human society are one and the same process. All further growth of social relations is entirely a matter of will. Society is the product of thought and will. It does not exist outside thought and will. Its being lies within man, not in the outer world. It is projected from within outwards. Society is cooperation. It is community in action. To say that society is an organism means that society is division of labor. To do justice to this idea, we must take into account all the aims which men set themselves and the means by which these are to be attained. It includes every interrelation of thinking and willing man. Modern man is a social being not only as one whose material needs could not be supplied in isolation, but also as one who has achieved a development of reason and of the perceptive faculty that would have been impossible except within society. Man is inconceivable as an isolated being, for humanity exists only as a social phenomenon, and mankind transcends the stage of animality only insofar as cooperation evolved the social relationships between the individuals. Evolution from the human animal to the human being was made possible by and achieved by means of social cooperation, and by that alone. And therein lies the interpretation of Aristotle's dictum that man is the zidonslatikon, the living body politic. Number 2, the division of labor as the principle of social development. We are still far from understanding the ultimate and most profound secret of life, the principle of the origin of organisms. Who knows whether we shall ever discover it? All we know today is that when organisms are formed, something which did not exist before is created out of individuals. Vegetable and animal organisms are more than conglomerations of single cells, and society is more than the sum of the individuals of which it is composed. We have not yet grasped the whole significance of this fact. Our thoughts are still limited by the mechanical theory of the conservation of energy and of matter, which is never able to tell us how one can become two. Here again, if we are to extend our knowledge of the nature of life, understanding of the social organization will have to precede that of the biological. Historically, division of labor originates in two facts of nature: the inequality of human abilities and the variety of the external conditions of human life on the earth. These two facts are really one: the diversity of nature, which does not repeat itself but creates the universe in infinite, inexhaustible variety. The special nature of our inquiry, however, which is directed towards sociological knowledge, justifies us in treating these two aspects separately. It is obvious that as soon as human action becomes conscious and logical, it must be influenced by these two conditions. They are indeed such as almost to force the division of labor on mankind. Old and young, men and women, cooperate by making appropriate use of their various abilities. Here also is the germ of the geographical division of labor. Man goes to the hunt and woman to the spring to fetch water. Had the strength and abilities of all individuals and the external conditions of production been everywhere equal, the idea of division of labor could never have arisen. Man would never of himself have hit upon the idea of making the struggle for existence easier by cooperation in the division of labor. No social life could have arisen among men of equal natural capacity in a world which was geographically uniform. Perhaps men would have joined together to cope with tasks which were beyond the strength of individuals. But such alliances do not make a society. The relations they create are transient and endure only for the occasion that brings them about. Their only importance in the origin of social life is that they create a rapprochement between men, which brings with it mutual recognition of the difference in the natural capacities of individuals, and thus in turn gives rise to the division of labor. Once labor has been divided, the division itself exercises a differentiating influence. The fact that labor is divided makes possible further cultivation of individual talent, and thus cooperation becomes more and more productive. Through cooperation, men are able to achieve what would have been beyond them as individuals, and even the work which individuals are capable of doing alone is made more productive. But all this can only be grasped fully when the conditions which govern increase of productivity under cooperation are set out with analytical precision. The theory of the international division of labor is one of the most important contributions of classical political economy. It shows that as long as, for any reasons, movements of capital and labor between countries are prevented, it is the comparative, not the absolute, costs of production which govern the geographical division of labor. When the same principle is applied to the personal division of labor, it is found that the individual enjoys an advantage in cooperating not only with people superior to himself in this or that capacity, but also with those who are inferior to himself in every relevant way. If through his superiority to B, A needs 3 hours labor for the production of 1 unit of commodity P compared with B's 5, and for the production of commodity Q, 2 hours against B's 4, then A will gain if he confines his labors to producing Q and leaves B to produce P. If each gives 60 hours to producing both P and Q, the result of A's labor is 20P plus 30Q, of B's 12P plus 15Q, and for both together 32P plus 45Q. If, however, A confines himself to producing Q alone, he produces 60 units in 120 hours, whilst B, if he confines himself to producing P, produces in the same time 24 units. The result of the activity is then 24P plus 60Q, which, as P has for A substitution value of 3 to 2Q, and for B 1 of 5 to 4Q, signifies a larger production than 32P plus 45Q. Therefore, it is obvious that every expansion of the personal division of labor brings advantages to all who take part in it. He who collaborates with the less talented, less able, and less industrious individuals gains an advantage equally as the men who associated with the more talented, more able, and more industrious. The advantage of the division of labor is mutual. It is not limited to the case where work is done which the solitary individual could never have carried out. The greater productivity of work under the division of labor is a unifying influence. It leads men to regard each other as comrades in a joint struggle for welfare, rather than as competitors in a struggle for existence. It makes friends out of enemies, peace out of war, society out of individuals. Number 3, organism and organization. Organism and organization are as different from each other as life is from a machine, as a flower which is natural from one which is artificial. In the natural plant, each cell lives its own life for itself, while functioning reciprocally with the others. What we call living is just this self-existence and self-maintenance. In the artificial plant, the separate parts are members of the whole only as far as the will of him who united them has been effective. Only to the extent to which this will is effective are the parts within the organization interrelated. Each part occupies only the place given to it, and leaves that place, so to speak, only on instructions. Within this framework, the parts can live, that is, exist for themselves, only insofar as the Creator has put them alive into His creation. The horse which the driver has harnessed to the cart lives as a horse. In the organization, the team, the horse is just as far into the vehicle as is an engine to the car it drives. The parts may use their life in opposition to the organization, as, for instance, when the horse runs away with the carriage, or the tissue out of which the artificial flower is made disintegrates under chemical action. Human organization is no different. Like society, it is a result of will. But in this case, the will no more produces a living social organism than the flower maker produces a living rose. The organization holds together as long as the creating will is effective, no longer. The parts which compose the organization merge into the whole only so far as the will of the Creator can impose itself upon them, and their life can be fixed in the organization. In the battalion on parade, there is one will, the will of the commander. Everything else, so far as it functions within the organization, is lifeless machinery. In this destruction of the will, or that portion of it which does not serve the purpose of the body of troops, lies the essence of military drill. The soldier in the phalangeal order, fighting in line, in which the body of troops must be nothing more than an organization, is drilled. Within the mass there is no life. Whatever life the individual lives is by the side of or outside the body of troops. Against it, perhaps, but never in it. Modern warfare, based on the skirmisher's personal enterprise, has to make use of the individual soldier, of his thought and his will. So the army no longer simply drills the soldier, it seeks to educate him. Organization is an association based on authority. Organism is mutuality. The primitive thinker always sees things as having been organized from outside, never as having grown themselves organically. He sees the arrow which he has carved. He knows how it came into existence and how it was set in motion. So he asks of everything he sees, who made it and who sets it in motion. He inquires after the creation of every form of life, the authors of every change in nature, and discovers an animistic explanation. Thus, the gods are born. Man sees the organized community with its contrast of rulers and ruled, and accordingly, he tries to understand life as an organization, not as an organism. Hence, the ancient conception of the head as the master of the body, and the use of the same term head for the chief of the organization. In recognizing the nature of the organism and sweeping away the exclusiveness of the concept of organization, science made one of its great steps forward. With all deference to earlier thinkers, one may say that in the domain of social science, this was achieved mainly in the 18th century, and that classical political economy and its immediate precursors played the chief part. Biology took up the good work, flinging off all animistic and vitalistic beliefs. For modern biology, the head is no longer the crown, the ruler of the body. In the living body, there is no longer leader and followers, a contrast of sovereign and subjects, of means and purpose. There are only members, organs. To seek to organize society is just as crazy as it would be to tear a living plant to bits in order to make a new one out of the dead parts. An organization of mankind can only be conceived after the living social organism has been killed. The collectivist movements are therefore foredoomed to failure. It may be possible to create an organization embracing all mankind, but this would always be merely an organization side by side with which social life would continue. It could be altered and destroyed by the forces of social life, and it certainly would be destroyed from the moment it tried to rebel against these forces. To make collectivism a fact, one must first kill all social life, then build up the collectivist state. The Bolshevists are thus quite logical in wishing to dissolve all traditional social ties, to destroy the social edifice built up through countless centuries, in order to erect a new structure on the ruins. Only they overlook the fact that isolated individuals, between whom no kind of social relations exist, can no longer be organized. Organizations are possible only as long as they are not directed against the organic or do it any injury. All attempts to coerce the living will of human beings into the service of something they do not want must fail. An organization cannot flourish unless it is founded on the will of those organized and serves their purposes. Number 4, the individual and society. Society is not mere reciprocity. There is reciprocity amongst animals, for example, when the wolf eats the lamb or when the wolf and she-wolf mate. Yet we do not speak of animal societies or of a society of wolves. Wolf and lamb, wolf and she-wolf are indeed members of an organism, the organism of nature. But this organism lacks the specific characteristic of the social organism. It is beyond the reach of will and action. For the same reason, the relation between the sexes is not as such a social relation. When a man and a woman come together, they follow the law which assigns to them their place in nature. Thus far they are ruled by instinct. Society exists only where willing becomes a co-willing and action co-action. To strive jointly towards aims which alone individuals could not reach at all, or not with equal effectiveness, that is society. Therefore, society is not an end but a means, the means by which each individual member seeks to attain his own ends. That society is possible at all is due to the fact that the will of one person and the will of another find themselves linked in a joint endeavor. Community of work springs from community of will. Because I can get what I want only if my fellow citizen gets what he wants, his will and action become the means by which I can attain my own end. Because my willing necessarily includes his willing, my intention cannot be to frustrate his will. On this fundamental fact, all social life is built up. The principle of the division of labor revealed the nature of the growth of society. Once the significance of the division of labor had been grasped, social knowledge developed at an extraordinary pace, as we see from a comparison between Kant and those who came after him. The doctrine of the division of labor as put forward by 18th century economists was far from fully developed when Kant wrote. It had yet to be made precise by the Ricardian theory of international trade. But the doctrine of the harmony of interests had already anticipated its far-reaching application to social theory. Kant was untouched by these ideas. His only explanation of society, therefore, is that there is an impulse in human beings to form a society, and a second contrary impulse that seeks to split up society. The antagonism of these two tendencies is used by nature to lead men towards the ultimate goal to which it wishes to lead them. It is difficult to imagine a more threadbare idea than such an attempt to explain society by the interplay of two impulses, the impulse to socialize oneself and the impulse to isolate oneself. Obviously, it goes no farther than the attempt to explain the effects of opium from the virtus dormitiva quis est natura sensus assupera, the sleep-inducing property whose nature is to dull the senses. Once it has been perceived that the division of labor is the essence of society, nothing remains of the antithesis between individual and society. The contradiction between individual principle and social principle disappears. Number 5. The development of the division of labor. Insofar as the individual becomes a social being under the influence of blind instinct, before thought and will are fully conscious, the formation of society cannot be the subject of sociological inquiry. But this does not mean that sociology must shift the task of explaining the origins of society onto another science, accepting the social web of mankind as a given fact. For if we decide, and this is the immediate consequence of equating society and division of labor, that the structure of society was incomplete at the appearance of the thinking and willing human being, and that the constructive process is continuous throughout history, then we must seek a principle which makes this evolution intelligible to us. The economic theory of the division of labor gives us this principle. It has been said that the happy accident which made possible the birth of civilization was the fact that divided labor is more productive than labor without division. The division of labor extends by the spread of the realization that the more labor is divided, the more productive it is. In this sense, the extension of the division of labor is economic progress. It brings production nearer to its goal, the greatest possible satisfaction of wants, and this progress is sociological progress also, for it involves the intensification of the social relation. It is only in this sense, and if all teleological or ethical valuation is excluded, that it is legitimate to use the expression progress sociologically in historical inquiry. We believe that we can observe a certain tendency in the changes of social conditions, and we examine each single change separately to see whether and how far this assumption is compatible with it. It may be that we make various assumptions of this kind, each of which corresponds in like measure to experience. The problem next arises of the relations between these assumptions, whether they are independent of each other or whether they are connected internally. We should then have to go further and define the nature of the connection. But all that this amounts to is a study free from valuation and based on a hypothesis of the course of successive changes. If we disregard those theories of evolution that are naively built up on value judgments, we shall find in the majority of the theories claiming to interpret social evolution two outstanding defects which render them unsatisfactory. The first is that their evolutionary principle is not connected with society as such. Neither Comte's law of the 3 stages of the human mind, nor Lamprecht's 5 stages of social psychical development, gives any clue to the inner and necessary connection between evolution of the mind and evolution of society. We are shown how society behaves when it has entered a new stage. But we want to know more. namely by what law society originates and transforms itself. The changes which we see as social changes are treated by such theories as facts acting on society from outside. But we need to understand them as the workings of a constant law. The second defeat is that all these theories are stage theories, Stufentheorien. For the stage theories, there is really no such thing as evolution. That is, no continuous change in which we can recognize a definite trend. The statements of these theories do not go beyond establishing a definite sequence of events. They give no proof of the causal connection between the stages constituting the sequence. At best, they succeed in establishing parallels between the sequence of events in different nations. But it is one thing to divide human life into childhood, youth, maturity, and old age. It is another to reveal the law which governs the growth and decay of the organism. A certain arbitrariness attaches to every theory of stages. The delimitation of the stages always fluctuates. Modern German economic history has undoubtedly done right in making the division of labor the basis of its theory of evolution. But it has not been able to free itself from the old traditional scheme of development by stages. Its theory is still a stage theory. Thus, Bucher distinguishes the stage of the closed domestic economy, pure production for one's own use, barterless economy; the stage of town economy, production for clients, the stage of direct exchange; and the stage of national economy, production for markets, the stage of the circulation of goods. Schmuller differentiates the periods of village economy, town economy, territorial economy, and state economy. Filipovich distinguishes closed domestic economy and trade economy, and within trade economy, he finds the period of the locally limited trade, the period of trade controlled by the state and limited to the state area, and the period of free trade, developed national economy, capitalism. Against these attempts to force evolution into a general scheme, many grave objections have been raised. We need not discuss what value such classification may have in revealing the characteristics of clearly defined historical epochs and how far they may be admitted as aids to description. At any rate, they should be used with great discretion. The barren dispute over the economic life of the nations of antiquity shows how easily such classifying may lead to our mistaking the shadows of scholastic word-splitting for the substance of historical reality. For sociological study, the stage theories are useless. They mislead us in regard to one of the most important problems of history, that of deciding how far historical evolution is continuous. The solution of this problem usually takes the form either of an assumption that social evolution, which it should be remembered is the development of the division of labor, has moved in an uninterrupted line, or by the assumption that each nation has progressed step by step over the same ground. Both assumptions are beside the point. It is absurd to say that evolution is uninterrupted when we can clearly discern periods of decay in history, periods when the division of labor has retrogressed. On the other hand, the progress achieved by individual nations by reaching a higher state of the division of labor is never completely lost. It spreads to other nations and hastens their evolution. The fall of the ancient world undoubtedly put back economic evolution for centuries. But more recent historical research has shown that the ties connecting the economic civilization of antiquity with that of the Middle Ages were much stronger than people used to assume. The exchange economy certainly suffered badly under the storm of the Great Migration of peoples, but it survived them. The towns on which it depended were not entirely ruined, and a link was soon made between the remnants of town life and the new development of traffic by barter. In the civilization of the towns, a fragment of the social achievements of antiquity was preserved and carried over into the life of the Middle Ages. Progress in the division of labor depends entirely on a realization of its advantages, that is, of its higher productivity. The truth of this first became fully evident through the free trade doctrines of the physiocrats and the classical 18th century political economy. But in rudiments it is found in all arguments favoring peace, wherever peace is praised or war condemned. History is a struggle between two principles: the peaceful principle, which advances the development of trade, and the militaristic imperialist principle, which interprets human society not as a friendly division of labor, but as the forcible repression of some of its members by others. The imperialistic principle continually regains the upper hand. The liberal principle cannot maintain itself against it until the inclination for peaceful labor inherent in the masses shall have struggled through to full recognition of its own importance as a principle of social evolution. Wherever the imperialistic principle is in force, peace can only be local and temporary. It never lasts longer than the facts which created it. The mental atmosphere with which imperialism surrounds itself is little suited to the promotion of the growth of the division of labor within state frontiers. It practically prohibits the extension of the division of labor beyond the political military barriers which separate the states. The division of labor needs liberty and peace. Only when the modern liberal thought of the 18th century had supplied a philosophy of peace and social collaboration was the basis laid for the astonishing development of the economic civilization of that age, an age branded by the latest imperialistic and socialistic doctrines as the age of crass materialism, egotism, and capitalism. Nothing could be more perverted than the conclusions drawn in this connection by the materialistic conception of history, which represents the development of social ideology as dependent on the stage of technical evolution which has been attained. Nothing is more erroneous than Marx's well-known saying, "The hand mill produces a society with feudal lords, the steam mill a society with industrial capitalists." It is not even formally correct. To try and explain social evolution through the evolution of technique is merely to sidetrack the problem without in any way solving it. For on such a conception, how are we to explain technical evolution itself? Ferguson showed that the development of technique depends on social conditions, and that each age gets as far in technique as is permitted by the stages it has reached in the social division of labor. Technical advances are possible only where the division of labor has prepared the way for their application. The mass manufacturing of shoes presupposes a society in which the production of shoes for hundreds of thousands or millions of human beings can be united in a few enterprises. In a society of self-sufficing peasants, there is no possible use for the steam mill. Only the division of labor could inspire the idea of placing mechanical forces at the service of manufacture. To trace the origin of everything concerned with society in the development of the division of labor has nothing in common with the gross and naive materialism of the technological and other materialistic theories of history. Nor does it by any means signify, as disciples of the idealistic philosophy are apt to maintain, an inadmissible limitation of the concept of social relations. Neither does it restrict society to the specifically material. That part of social life which lies beyond the economic is indeed the ultimate aim, but the ways which lead to it are governed by the law of all rational action. Wherever they come into question, there is economic action. Number 6. Changes in the individual in society. The most important effect of the division of labor is that it turns the independent individual into a dependent social being. Under the division of labor, social man changes, like the cell which adapts itself to be part of an organism. He adapts himself to new ways of life, permits some energies and organs to atrophy, and develops others. He becomes one-sided. The whole tribe of romantics, the unbending laudatores temporis acti, praisers of time past, have deplored this fact. For them, the man of the past who developed his powers harmoniously is the ideal. An ideal which, alas, no longer inspires our degenerate age. They recommend retrogression in the division of labor, hence their praise of agricultural labor, by which they always mean the almost self-sufficing peasant. Here, again, the modern socialist outdoes the rest. Marx promises that in the higher phase of the communist society, the enslaving subjection of individuals under the division of labor, and with this also the contrast between mental and bodily labor, shall have disappeared. Account will be taken of the human need for change. Alternation of mental and bodily labor will safeguard man's harmonious development. We have already dealt with this illusion. Were it possible to achieve all human aims with only that amount of labor which does not itself cause any discomfort, but at the same time relieves the sensation of displeasure that arises from doing nothing, then labor would not be an economic object at all. To satisfy needs would not be work but play. This, however, is not possible. Even the self-sufficient worker, for the most part, must labor far beyond the point where the effort is agreeable. One may assume that work is less unpleasant to him than to the worker who is tied to a definite task, as he finds at the beginning of each job he tackles fresh sensations of pleasure in the activity itself. If, nevertheless, man has given himself up more and more to the division of labor, it is because he has recognized that the higher productivity of labor, thus specialized, more than repays him for the loss of pleasure. The extent of the division of labor cannot be curtailed without reducing the productivity of labor. This is true of all kinds of labor. It is an illusion to believe that one can maintain productivity and reduce the division of labor. Abolition of the division of labor would be no remedy for the injuries inflicted on the individual, body and soul, by specialized labor, unless we are prepared to set back social development. It is for the individual himself to set about becoming a complete human being. The remedy lies in reforming consumption, not in reforming labor. Play and sport, the pleasure of art, reading, are the obvious ways of escape. It is futile to look for the harmoniously developed man at the outset of economic evolution. The almost self-sufficient economic subject as we know him in the solitary peasant of remote valleys shows none of that noble harmonious development of body, mind, and feeling, which the Romantics ascribe to him. Civilization is a product of leisure and the peace of mind that only the division of labor can make possible. Nothing is more false than to assume that man first appeared in history with an independent individuality, and that only during the evolution which led to the Great Society did he lose, together with material freedom, his spiritual independence. All history, evidence, and observation of the lives of primitive peoples is directly contrary to this view. Primitive man lacks all individuality in our sense. Two South Sea Islanders resemble each other far more closely than two 20th century Londoners. Personality was not bestowed upon man at the outset. It has been acquired in the course of evolution of society. Number 7. Social regression. Social evolution, in the sense of evolution of the division of labor, is a will phenomenon. It depends entirely on the human will. We do not consider whether one is justified in regarding every advance in the division of labor, and hence in the intensification of the social bond, as a rise to a higher stage. We must ask whether such a development is a necessary phenomenon. Is an ever greater development of society the content of history? Is it possible for society to stand still or retrogress? We must reject a priori any assumption that historical evolution is provided with a goal by any intention or hidden plan of nature, such as Kant imagined and Hegel and Marx had in mind. But we cannot avoid the inquiry whether a principle might not be found to demonstrate that continuous social growth is inevitable. The first principle that offers itself to our attention is the principle of natural selection. More highly developed societies attain greater material wealth than the less highly developed. Therefore, they have more prospect of preserving their members from misery and poverty. They are also better equipped to defend themselves from the enemy. One must not be misled by the observation that richer and more civilized nations were often crushed in war by nations less wealthy and civilized. Nations in an advanced stage of social evolution have always been able at least to resist a superior force of less developed nations. It is only decaying nations, civilizations inwardly disintegrated, which have fallen a prey to nations on the upgrade. Where a more highly organized society has succumbed to the attack of a less developed people, the victors have in the end been culturally submerged, accepting the economic and social order, and even the language and faith of the conquered race. The superiority of the more highly developed societies lies not only in their material welfare, but also quantitatively in the number of their members, and qualitatively in the greater solidity of their internal structure. For this precisely is the key to higher social development: the widening of the social range, the inclusion in the division of labor of more human beings and its stronger grip on each individual. The more highly developed society differs from the less developed in the closer union of its members. This precludes the violent solution of internal conflict, and forms externally a closed defensive front against any enemy. In less developed societies where the social bond is still weak, and between the separate parts of which there exists a confederation for the purposes of war rather than true solidarity based on joint work and economic cooperation, disagreement breaks out more easily and more quickly than in highly developed societies. For the military confederation has no firm and lasting hold upon its members. By its very nature, it is merely a temporary bond which is upheld by the prospect of momentary advantage, but dissolves as soon as the enemy has been defeated, and the scramble for the booty sets in. In fighting against the less developed societies, the more developed ones have always found that their greatest advantage lay in the lack of unity in the enemy's ranks. Only temporarily do the nations in a lower state of organization manage to cooperate for greater military enterprises. Internal disunity has always dispersed their armies quickly. Take, for example, the Mongol raids on the Central European civilization of the 13th century, or the efforts of the Turks to penetrate into the West. The superiority of the industrial over the military type of society, to use Herbert Spencer's expression, consists largely in the fact that associations which are merely military always fall to pieces through internal disunity. But there is another circumstance which advances further social development. It has been shown that it is to the interest of all members of society that the social range should be extended. For a highly developed social organism, it is by no means a matter of indifference whether or not nations outside its range continue to lead a self-sufficient existence on a lower plane of social evolution. It is to the interest of the more advanced organism to draw the less advanced into the area of its economic and social community, even though its persistence in remaining on a lower plane makes it politically and militarily innocuous. And even though no immediate advantages are likely to accrue from the occupation of its territory, in which presumably the natural conditions of production are unfavorable. We have seen that it is always an advantage to widen the range of workers in a society that divides labor, so that even a more efficient people may have an interest in cooperating with a less efficient. This is what so often drives nations of a high social development to expand their field of economic activity by absorbing hitherto inaccessible territories. The opening up of the backward regions of the Near and Far East, of Africa and America, cleared the way for a worldwide economic community, so that shortly before the World War we were in sight of realizing the dream of an ecumenical society. Has the war merely interrupted this development for a brief period, or has it utterly destroyed it? It is conceivable that this development can cease, that society can even retrogress. This problem cannot be approached except in connection with another, the problem of the death of nations. It is customary to talk of nations aging and dying, of young and old communities. The comparison is lame, as are all comparisons, and in discussing such things we are well advised to discard metaphorical phrases. What is the core of the problem that here presents itself? It is clear that we must not confuse it with another not less difficult problem, the problem of the changes of the national quality. 1,000 or 1,500 years ago the Germans spoke a different language from that of today. But we should not think of saying on that account that German medieval culture was dead. On the contrary, we see in the German culture an uninterrupted evolutionary chain, stretching, without mentioning lost monuments of literature, from the Heiland and Ottfried's Gospels to the present day. We do indeed say of the Pomeranians and Prussians, who in the course of centuries have been assimilated by the German colonists, that they have died out, yet we shall hardly maintain that as nations they grew old. To carry through the simile, one would have to talk of nations that had died young. We are not concerned with national transformation. Our problem is different. Neither does the decay of states come into the question, for this phenomenon sometimes appears as a sequence to the aging nations, and sometimes independently of it. The fall of the ancient state of Poland had nothing to do with any decay of Polish civilization or of the Polish people. It did not stop the social development of Poland. The facts which are present in practically all the examples brought forward of the aging of a culture are a decline in population, a diminution of welfare, and the decay of the towns. The historical significance of all these phenomena becomes clear as soon as we conceive of the aging of nations as the retrogression of the social division of labor and of society. The decline of the ancient world, for instance, was a social retrogression. The decline of the Roman Empire was only a result of the disintegration of ancient society, which, after reaching a high level of division of labor, sank back into an almost moneyless economy. Thus, towns were depopulated, and thus, also, did the population of the countryside diminish, and want and misery set in simply because an economic order, working on a lower level, in respect of the social division of labor, is less productive. Technical skill was gradually lost. Artistic talent decayed. Scientific thought was slowly extinguished. The word which most aptly describes this process is disintegration. The classical culture died because classical society retrogressed. The death of nations is the retrogression of the social relation, the retrogression of the division of labor. Whatever may have been the cause in individual cases, it has always been the cessation of the disposition to social cooperation, which actually effected the decline. This may once have seemed an incomprehensible riddle to us, but now that we watch with terror the process at work in our own experience, we come nearer to understanding it, though we still fail to recognize the deepest, most ultimate cause of the change. It is the social spirit, the spirit of social cooperation, which forms, develops, and upholds societies. Once it is lost, the society falls apart again. The death of a nation is social retrogression, the decline from the division of labor to self-sufficiency. The social organism disintegrates into the cells from which it began. Man remains, but society dies. There is no evidence that social evolution must move steadily upwards in a straight line. Social standstill and social retrogression are historical facts which we cannot ignore. World history is the graveyard of dead civilizations, and in India and Eastern Asia we see large-scale examples of civilization at a standstill. Our literary and artistic cliques, whose exaggerated opinion of their own trifling productions contrast so vividly with the modesty and self-criticism of the really great artists, say that it does not matter much whether economic evolution continues so long as inner culture is intensified. But all inner culture requires external means for its realization, and these external means can be attained only by economic effort. When the productivity of labor decays through the retrogression of social cooperation, the decay of inner culture follows. All the older civilizations were born and grew up without being fully conscious of the basic laws of cultural evolution and the significance of division of labor and cooperation. In the course of their development, they had often to combat tendencies and movements inimical to civilization. Often they triumphed over these, but sooner or later they fell. They succumbed to the spirit of disintegration. Through the social philosophy of liberalism, men became conscious of the laws of social evolution for the first time, and for the first time clearly recognized the basis of civilization and cultural progress. Those were days when hopes for the future ran high. Unimagined vistas seemed to be opening up. But it was not to be. Liberalism had to meet the opposition of militaristic nationalist, and above all of socialist communist doctrines, which tended to bring about social dissolution. The nationalist theory calls itself organic. The socialist theory calls itself social. But in reality, both are disorganizing and antisocial in their effect. Of all accusations against the system of free trade and private property, none is more foolish than the statement that it is antisocial and individualistic, and that it atomizes the body social. Trade does not disintegrate, as romantic enthusiasts for the autarky of small portions of the Earth's surface assert. It unites. The division of labor is what first makes social ties. It is the social element pure and simple. Whoever advocates the economic self-sufficiency of nations and states seeks to disintegrate the ecumenical society. Whoever seeks to destroy the social division of labor within a nation by means of class war is antisocial. A decline of the ecumenical society, which has been slowly forming itself during the last 200 years under the influence of the gradual germination of the liberal idea, would be a world catastrophe, absolutely without parallel in history as we know it. No nation would be spared. Who then would rebuild the shattered world? Number 8. Private property and social evolution. The division of individuals into owners and non-owners is an outcome of the division of labor. The second great sociological achievement of classical political economy and the individualistic social theory of the 18th century was to recognize the social function of private property. From the older point of view, property was always considered more or less a privilege of the few, a raid upon the common stock, an institution regarded ethically as an evil, if sometimes as an inevitable one. Liberalism was the first to recognize that the social function of private ownership in the means of production is to put the goods into the hands of those who know best how to use them, into the hands, that is, of the most expert managers. Nothing, therefore, is more foreign to the essence of property than special privileges for special property and protection for special producers. Any kind of constraint, such as exclusive rights and other privileges of producers, are apt to obstruct the working of the social function of property. Liberalism fights such institutions as vigorously as it opposes every attempt to limit the freedom of the worker. The owner takes nothing away from anyone. No one can say that he goes short because of another's abundance. It is flattering the envious instincts of the masses to give them a calculation of how much more the poor man would have to dispose of if property were equally distributed. What is overlooked is the fact that the volume of production and of the social income are not fixed and unchangeable, but depend essentially upon the distribution of property. If this is interfered with, there is danger that property may fall into the hands of those not so competent to maintain it, those whose foresight is less, whose disposal of their means is less productive. This would necessarily reduce the amount produced. The ideas of distributive communism are atavistic, harking back to the times before social relations existed or reached their present stage of development, when the yield of production was correspondingly much lower. The landless man of an economic order based on production without exchange is quite logical in making the redistribution of fields the goal of his ambition. But the modern proletarian misunderstands the nature of social production when he hankers after a similar redistribution. Liberalism combats the social ideal of transferring the means of production to the hands of organized society with the argument that socialist production would give a lower yield. Against this, the socialism of the Hegelian school seeks to prove that the evolution of history leads inevitably to the abolition of private ownership in the means of production. It was the view of Lassalle that the course of all legal history consists, generally speaking, in an ever greater limitation of the property of the individual, and in placing more and more objects outside private ownership. The tendency to enlarge the freedom of property, which is read into historical evolution, is only apparent. However much the idea of the increasingly rapid reduction of the sphere of private property as a principle working in the cultural and historical development of law could be held to be paradoxical, yet according to Lassalle it survived the most detailed examination. Unfortunately, Lassalle produced no details of the examination of this idea. According to his own words, he honored it, the idea, with a few very superficial glances instead. Neither has anyone since Lassalle's time undertaken to provide a proof. But even if the attempt had been made, this fact would by no means have demonstrated the necessity of the development in question. The conceptual constructions of speculative jurisprudence steeped in the Hegelian spirit served at best to exhibit historical tendencies of evolution in the past. That the evolutionary tendency thus discovered must necessarily continue to develop is a thoroughly arbitrary assumption. Only if it could be shown that the force behind evolution was still active would the hypothetical proof which is needed be adduced. The Hegelian Lassalle did nothing of the kind. For him, the matter is disposed of when he realizes that this progressive reduction of the sphere of private property is based on nothing else than the positive development of human liberty. Having fitted his law of evolution into the great Hegelian scheme of historical evolution, he had done all that his school could ask. Marx saw the faults in the Hegelian scheme of evolution. He too holds it to be an indisputable truth that the course of history leads from private property to common property. But unlike Hegel and Lassalle, he does not deal with the idea of property and the juristic concept of property. Private property, in its political economic tendencies, is drifting towards its dissolution, but only by a development independent of which it is unconscious, which is taking place against its will, and is conditioned by the nature of the question. Only by creating the proletariat qua proletariat, the misery that is conscious of its spiritual and physical misery, the dehumanization that is conscious of its dehumanization. Thus, the doctrine of the class struggle is introduced as the driving element of historical evolution. Human action. Number 1. Human cooperation. Society is concerted action, cooperation. Society is the outcome of conscious and purposeful behavior. This does not mean that individuals have concluded contracts by virtue of which they have founded human society. The actions which have brought about social cooperation and daily bring it about anew do not aim at anything else than cooperation and coadjuvancy with others for the attainment of definite singular ends. The total complex of the mutual relations created by such concerted actions is called society. It substitutes collaboration for the, at least conceivable, isolated life of individuals. Society is a division of labor and combination of labor. In his capacity as an acting animal, man becomes a social animal. Individual man is born into a socially organized environment. In this sense alone, we may accept the saying that society is, logically or historically, antecedent to the individual. In every other sense, this dictum is either empty or nonsensical. The individual lives and acts within society. But society is nothing but the combination of individuals for cooperative effort. It exists nowhere else than in the actions of individual men. It is a delusion to search for it outside the actions of individuals. To speak of a society's autonomous and independent existence, of its life, its soul, and its actions, is a metaphor which can easily lead to crass errors. The questions whether society or the individual is to be considered as the ultimate end, and whether the interests of society should be subordinated to those of the individuals or the interests of the individuals to those of society, are fruitless. Action is always action of individual men. The social or societal element is a certain orientation of the actions of individual men. The category end makes sense only when applied to action. Theology and the metaphysics of history may discuss the ends of society and the designs which God wants to realize with regard to society in the same way in which they discuss the purpose of all other parts of the created universe. For science, which is inseparable from reason, a tool manifestly unfit for the treatment of such problems, it would be hopeless to embark upon speculations concerning these matters. Within the frame of social cooperation, there can emerge between members of society feelings of sympathy and friendship, and a sense of belonging together. These feelings are the source of man's most delightful and most sublime experiences. They are the most precious adornment of his life. They lift the animal species man to the heights of a really human existence. However, they are not, as some have asserted, the agents that have brought about social relationships. They are fruits of social cooperation. They thrive only within its frame. They did not precede the establishment of social relations and are not the seed from which they spring. The fundamental facts that brought about cooperation, society, and civilization, and transformed the animal man into a human being, are the facts that work performed under the division of labor is more productive than isolated work, and that man's reason is capable of recognizing this truth. But for these facts, men would have forever remained deadly foes of one another, irreconcilable rivals in their endeavors to secure a portion of the scarce supply of means of sustenance provided by nature. Each man would have been forced to view all other men as his enemies. His craving for the satisfaction of his own appetites would have brought him into an implacable conflict with all his neighbors. No sympathy could possibly develop under such a state of affairs. Some sociologists have asserted that the original and elementary subjective fact in society is a consciousness of kind. Others maintain that there would be no social systems if there were no sense of community or of belonging together. One may agree, provided that these somewhat vague and ambiguous terms are correctly interpreted. We may call consciousness of kind, sense of community, or sense of belonging together the acknowledgement of the fact that all other human beings are potential collaborators in the struggle for survival because they are capable of recognizing the mutual benefits of cooperation, while the animals lack this faculty. However, we must not forget that the primary facts that bring about such consciousness, or such a sense, are the two mentioned above. In a hypothetical world in which the division of labor would not increase productivity, there would not be any society. There would not be any sentiments of benevolence and goodwill. The principle of the division of labor is one of the great basic principles of cosmic becoming and evolutionary change. The biologists were right in borrowing the concept of the division of labor from social philosophy, and in adapting it to their field of investigation. There is division of labor between the various parts of any living organism. There are furthermore organic entities composed of collaborating animal individuals. It is customary to call metaphorically such aggregations of the ants and bees animal societies. But one must never forget that the characteristic feature of human society is purposeful cooperation. Society is an outcome of human action, i.e., of a conscious aiming at the attainment of ends. No such element is present, as far as we can ascertain, in the process which have resulted in the emergence of the structure-function systems of plant and animal bodies, and in the operation of the societies of ants, bees, and hornets. Human society is an intellectual and spiritual phenomenon. It is the outcome of a purposeful utilization of a universal law determining cosmic becoming, vis-a-vis the higher productivity of the division of labor. As with every instance of action, the recognition of the laws of nature is put into the service of man's effort to improve his conditions. Number 3, the division of labor. The fundamental social phenomenon is the division of labor and its counterpart, human cooperation. Experience teaches men that cooperative action is more efficient and productive than isolated action of self-sufficient individuals. The natural conditions determining man's life and effort are such that the division of labor increases output per unit of labor expended. These natural facts are: first, the innate inequality of men with regard to their ability to perform various kinds of labor. Second, the unequal distribution of the nature-given, non-human opportunities of production on the surface of the earth. One may as well consider these two facts as one and the same fact, namely, the manifoldness of nature, which makes the universe a complex of infinite varieties. If the Earth's surface were such that the physical conditions of production were the same at every point, and if one man were as equal to all other men as is a circle to another with the same diameter in Euclidean geometry, division of labor would not offer any advantages for acting men. There is still a third fact vis-a-vis that there are undertakings whose accomplishment exceeds the forces of a single man and requires the joint effort of several. Some of them require an expenditure of labor which no single man can perform because his capacity to work is not great enough. Others again could be accomplished by individuals, but the time which they would have to devote to the work would be so long that the result would only be attained late and would not compensate for the labor expended. In both cases, only joint effort makes it possible to attain the end sought. If only this third condition were present, temporary cooperation between men would have certainly emerged. However, such transient alliances to cope with specific tasks which are beyond the strength of an individual would not have brought about lasting social cooperation. Undertakings which could be performed only in this way were not very numerous at the early stages of civilization. Moreover, all those concerned may not often agree that the performance in question is more useful and urgent than the accomplishment of other tasks which they could perform alone. The great human society enclosing all men in all of their activities did not originate from such occasional alliances. Society is much more than a passing alliance concluded for a definite purpose and ceasing as soon as its objective is realized, even if the partners are ready to renew it should an occasion present itself. The increase in productivity brought about by the division of labor is obvious whenever the inequality of the participants is such that every individual or every piece of land is superior, at least in one regard, to the other individuals or pieces of land concerned. If A is fit to produce in 1 unit of time 6p or 4q, and B only 2p but 8q, they both, when working in isolation, will produce together 4p plus 6q. When working under the division of labor, each of them producing only that commodity in whose production he is more efficient than his partner, they will produce 6p and 8q. But what will happen if A is more efficient than B, not only in the production of P, but also in the production of Q? This is the problem which Ricardo raised and solved immediately. Number 4. The Ricardian Law of Association. Ricardo expounded the law of association in order to demonstrate what the consequences of the division of labor are when an individual or a group, more efficient in every regard, cooperates with an individual or a group less efficient in every regard. He investigated the effects of trade between two areas, unequally endowed by nature, under the assumption that the products, but not the workers and the accumulated factors of future production, capital goods, can freely move from each area into the other. The division of labor between two such areas will, as Ricardo's law shows, increase the productivity of labor and is therefore advantageous to all concerned, even if the physical conditions of production for any commodity are more favorable in one of these two areas than in the other. It is advantageous for the better endowed area to concentrate its efforts upon the production of those commodities for which its superiority is greater, and to leave to the less endowed area the production of other goods in which its own superiority is less. The paradox that it is more advantageous to leave more favorable domestic conditions of production unused, and to procure the commodities they could produce from areas in which conditions for their production are less favorable, is the outcome of the immobility of labor and capital, to which the more favorable places of production are inaccessible. Ricardo was fully aware of the fact that his law of comparative cost, which he expounded mainly in order to deal with a special problem of international trade, is a particular instance of the more universal law of association. If A is in such a way more efficient than B, that he needs for the production of 1 unit of the commodity P 3 hours compared with B's 5, and for the production of 1 unit of Q 2 hours compared with B's 4, then both will gain if A confines himself to producing Q and leaves B to produce P. If each of them gives 60 hours to producing P and 60 hours to producing Q, the result of A's labor is 20p plus 30q, of B's 12p plus 15q, and for both together 32p plus 45q. If, however, A confines himself to producing Q alone, he produces 60Q in 120 hours, while B, if he confines himself to producing P, produces in the same time 24P. The result of their activities is then 24P plus 60Q, which, as P has for A a substitution ratio of 3 over 2Q, and for B one of 5 over 4Q, signifies a larger output than 32P plus 45Q. Therefore, it is manifest that the division of labor brings advantages to all who take part in it. Collaboration of the more talented, more able, and more industrious with the less talented, less able, and less industrious result in benefit for both. The gains derived from the division of labor are always mutual. The law of association makes us comprehend the tendencies which resulted in the progressive intensification of human cooperation. We conceive what incentive induced people not to consider themselves simply as rivals in a struggle for the appropriation of the limited supply of means of subsistence made available by nature. We realize what has impelled them and permanently impels them to consort with one another for the sake of cooperation. Every step forward on the way to a more developed mode of the division of labor serves the interest of all participants. In order to comprehend why man did not remain solitary, searching like the animals for food and shelter for himself only, and at most also for his consort and his helpless infants, we do not need to have recourse to a miraculous interference of the deity, or to the empty hypostasis of an innate urge toward association. Neither are we forced to assume that the isolated individuals or primitive hordes one day pledged themselves by a contract to establish social bonds. The factor that brought about primitive society and daily works towards its progressive intensification is human action that is animated by the insight into the higher productivity of labor achieved under the division of labor. Neither history nor ethnology nor any other branch of knowledge can provide a description of the evolution which has led from the packs and flocks of mankind's non-human ancestors to the primitive yet already highly differentiated societal groups about which information is provided in excavations, in the most ancient documents of history, and in the reports of explorers and travelers who have met savage tribes. The task with which science is faced in respect of the origins of society can only consist in the demonstration of those factors which can and must result in association and its progressive intensification. Praxeology solves the problem. If and as far as labor under the division of labor is more productive than isolated labor, and if and as far as man is able to realize this fact, human action itself tends toward cooperation and association. Man becomes a social being not in sacrificing his own concerns for the sake of a mythical Moloch, society, but in aiming at an improvement in his own welfare. Experience teaches that this condition, higher productivity achieved under the division of labor, is present because its cause, the inborn inequality of men, and the inequality in the geographical distribution of the natural factors of production, is real. Thus we are in a position to comprehend the course of social evolution. Current errors concerning the law of association. People cavil much about Ricardo's law of association, better known under the name of the law of comparative cost. The reason is obvious. This law is an offense to all those eager to justify protection and national economic isolation from any point of view other than the selfish interests of some producers or the issues of war preparedness. Ricardo's first aim in expounding this law was to refute an objection raised against freedom of international trade. The protectionist asks, what under free trade will be the fate of a country in which the conditions for any kind of production are less favorable than in all other countries? Now, in a world in which there is free mobility not only for products, but no less for capital goods and for labor, a country so little suited for production would cease to be used as the seat of any human industry. If people fare better without exploiting the comparatively unsatisfactory physical conditions of production offered by this country, They will not settle here and will leave it as uninhabited as the polar regions, the tundras, and the deserts. But Ricardo deals with a world whose conditions are determined by settlement in earlier days, a world in which capital goods and labor are bound to the soil by definite institutions. In such a milieu-free trade, i.e. the free mobility of commodities only, cannot bring about a state of affairs in which capital and labor are distributed on the surface of the earth according to the better or poorer physical opportunities afforded to the productivity of labor. Here the law of comparative cost comes into operation. Each country turns toward those branches of production for which its conditions offer comparatively, although not absolutely, the most favorable opportunities. For the inhabitants of a country, it is more advantageous to abstain from the exploitation of some opportunities, which, absolutely and technologically, are more propitious, and to import commodities produced abroad under conditions which, absolutely and technologically, are less favored than the unused domestic resources. The case is analogous to that of a surgeon who finds it convenient to employ for the cleaning of the operating room and the instruments a man whom he excels in this performance also, and to devote himself exclusively to surgery, in which his superiority is higher. The theorem of comparative cost is in no way connected with the value theory of classical economics. It does not deal with value or with prices. It is an analytic judgment. The conclusion is implied in the two propositions that the technically movable factors of production differ with regard to their productivity in various places and are institutionally restricted in their mobility. The theorem, without prejudice to the correctness of its conclusions, can disregard problems of valuation because it is free to resort to a set of simple assumptions. These are that only two products are to be produced, that these products are freely movable, that for the production of each of them two factors are required, that one of these factors, it may be either labor or capital goods, is identical in the production of both, while the other factor, a specific property of the soil, is different for each of the two processes, that the greater scarcity of the factor common to both processes determines the extent of the exploitation of the different factor. In the frame of these assumptions, which make it possible to establish substitution ratios between the expenditure of the common factor and the output, the theorem answers the question raised. The law of comparative cost is as independent of the classical theory of value as is the law of returns, which its reasoning resembles. In both cases, we can content ourselves with comparing only physical input and physical output. With the laws of returns, we compare the output of the same product. With the law of comparative costs, we compare the output of two different products. Such a comparison is feasible because we assume that for the production of each of them, apart from one specific factor, only non-specific factors of the same kind are required. Some critics blame the law of comparative cost for the simplification of assumptions. They believe that the modern theory of value would require a reformulation of the law in conformity with the principles of subjective value. Only such a formulation could provide a satisfactory conclusive demonstration. However, they do not want to calculate in terms of money. They prefer to resort to those methods of utility analysis which they consider a means for making value calculations in terms of utility. It will be shown in the further progress of our investigation that these attempts to eliminate monetary terms from economic calculation are delusive. Their fundamental assumptions are untenable and contradictory, and all formulas derived from them are vicious. No method of economic calculation is possible other than one based on money prices as determined by the market. The meaning of the simple assumption underlying the law of comparative cost is not precisely the same for the modern economists as it was for the classical economists. Some adherents of the classical school considered them as the starting point of a theory of value in international trade. We know now that they were mistaken in this belief. Besides, we realize that with regard to the determination of value and of prices, there is no difference between domestic and foreign trade. What makes people distinguish between the home market and markets abroad is only a difference in the data, i.e. varying institutional conditions, restricting the mobility of factors of production and of products. If we do not want to deal with the law of comparative cost under these simplified assumptions applied by Ricardo, we must openly employ money calculation. We must not fall prey to the illusion that a comparison between the expenditure of factors of production of various kinds and of the output of products of various kinds can be achieved without the aid of money calculation. If we consider the case of the surgeon and his handyman, we must say, if the surgeon can employ his limited working time for the performance of operations for which he is compensated at $50 per hour, it is to his interest to employ a handyman to keep his instruments in good order and to pay him $2 per hour, although this man needs 3 hours to accomplish what the surgeon could do in 1 hour. In comparing the conditions of two countries, we must say, if conditions are such that in England the production of 1 unit of each of the two commodities, A and B, requires the expenditure of 1 working day of the same kind of labor, while in India with the same investment of capital for A 2 days and for B 3 days are required, and if capital goods and A and B are freely movable from England to India and vice versa, while there is no mobility of labor, wage rates in India in the production of A must tend to be 50%, and in the production of B, 33 1/3% of the English rates. If the English rate is 6 shillings, the rate in India would be the equivalent of 3 shillings in the production of A, and the equivalent of 2 shillings in the production of B. Such a discrepancy in the remuneration of labor of the same kind cannot last if there is mobility of labor on the domestic Indian labor market. Workers would shift from the production of B into the production of A. Their migration would tend to lower the remuneration in the A industry and to raise it in the B industry. Finally, Indian wage rates would be equal in both industries. The production of A would tend to expand and to supplant English competition. On the other hand, the production of B would become unprofitable in India and would have to be discontinued, while it would expand in England. The same reasoning is valid if we assume that the difference in the conditions of production consists also or exclusively in the amount of capital investment needed. It has been asserted that Ricardo's law was valid only for his age and is of no avail for our time, which offers other conditions. Ricardo saw the difference between domestic trade and foreign trade in differences in the mobility of capital and labor. If one assumes that capital, labor, and products are movable, then there exists a difference between regional and interregional trade, only as far as the cost of transportation comes into play. Then it is superfluous to develop a theory of international trade as distinguished from national trade. Capital and labor are distributed on the Earth's surface according to the better or poorer conditions which the various regions offer to production. There are areas more densely populated and better equipped with capital. There are others less densely populated and poorer in capital supply. There prevails on the whole earth a tendency toward an equalization of wage rates for the same kind of labor. Ricardo, however, starts from the assumption that there is mobility of capital and labor only within each country, and not between the various countries. He raises the question what the consequences of the free mobility of products must be under such conditions. If there is no mobility of products either, then every country is economically isolated and autarkic, and there is no international trade at all. The theory of comparative cost answers this question. Now, Ricardo's assumptions by and large held good for his age. Later in the course of the 19th century, conditions changed. The immobility of capital and labor gave way. International transfer of capital and labor became more and more common. Then came a reaction. Today, capital and labor are again restricted in their mobility. Reality again corresponds to the Ricardian assumptions. However, the teachings of the classical theory of interregional trade are above any change in institutional conditions. They enable us to study the problems involved under any imaginable assumptions. Number 5. The effects of the division of labor. The division of labor is the outcome of man's conscious reaction to the multiplicity of natural conditions. On the other hand, it is itself a factor bringing about differentiation. It assigns to the various geographic areas specific functions in the complex of the processes of production. It makes some areas urban, others rural. It locates the various branches of manufacturing, mining, and agriculture in different places. Still more important, however, is the fact that it intensifies the innate inequality of men. Exercise and practice of specific tasks adjust individuals better to the requirements of their performance. Men develop some of their inborn faculties and stunt the development of others. Vocational types emerge, people become specialists. The division of labor splits the various processes of production into minute tasks, many of which can be performed by mechanical devices. It is this fact that made the use of machinery possible and brought about the amazing improvements in technical methods of production. Mechanization is the fruit of the division of labor, its most beneficial achievement, not its motive and fountain spring. Power-driven specialized machinery could be employed only in a social environment, under the division of labor. Every step forward on the road toward the use of more specialized, more refined, and more productive machines requires a further specialization of tasks. Number 6. The individual within society. If praxeology speaks of the solitary individual acting on his own behalf only and independent of fellow men, it does so for the sake of a better comprehension of the problems of social cooperation. We do not assert that such isolated autarkic human beings have ever lived, and that the social stage of man's history was preceded by an age of independent individuals roaming like animals in search of feed. The biological humanization of man's non-human ancestors and the emergence of the primitive social bonds were effected in the same process. Man appeared on the scene of earthly events as a social being. The isolated asocial man is a fictitious construction. Seen from the point of view of the individual, society is the great means for the attainment of all his ends. The preservation of society is an essential condition of any plans an individual may want to realize by any action whatever. Even the refractory delinquent who fails to adjust his conduct to the requirements of life within the societal system of cooperation does not want to miss any of the advantages derived from the division of labor. He does not consciously aim at the destruction of society. He wants to lay his hands on a greater portion of the jointly produced wealth than the social order assigns to him. He would feel miserable if antisocial behavior were to become universal and its inevitable outcome, the return to primitive indigence, resulted. It is illusory to maintain that individuals, in renouncing the alleged blessings of a fabulous state of nature and entering into society, have foregone some advantages and have a fair claim to be indemnified for what they have lost. The idea that anybody would have fared better under an asocial state of mankind and is wronged by the very existence of society is absurd. Thanks to the higher productivity of social cooperation, the human species has multiplied far beyond the margin of subsistence offered by the conditions prevailing in ages with a rudimentary degree of the division of labor. Each man enjoys a standard of living much higher than that of his savage ancestors. The natural condition of man is extreme poverty and insecurity. It is romantic nonsense to lament the passing of the happy days of primitive barbarism. In a state of savagery, the complainants would either not have reached the age of manhood, or if they had, they would have lacked the opportunities and amenities provided by civilization. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Frederick Engels, if they had lived in the primitive state which they describe with nostalgic yearning, would not have enjoyed the leisure required for their studies and for the writing of their books. One of the privileges which society affords to the individuals is the privilege of living in spite of sickness or physical disability. Sick animals are doomed. Their weakness handicaps them in their attempts to find food and to repel aggression on the part of other animals. Deaf, nearsighted, or crippled savages must perish. But such defects do not deprive a man of the opportunity to adjust himself to life in society. The majority of our contemporaries are afflicted with some bodily deficiencies which biology considers pathological. Our civilization is to a great extent the achievement of such men. The eliminative forces of natural selection are greatly reduced under social conditions. Hence, some people say that civilization tends to deteriorate the hereditary qualities of the members of society. Such judgments are reasonable if one looks at mankind with the eyes of a breeder, intent upon raising a race of men equipped with certain qualities. But society is not a stud farm operated for the production of a definite type of men. There is no natural standard to establish what is desirable and what is undesirable in the biological evolution of man. Any standard chosen is arbitrary, purely subjective, in short, a judgment of value. The terms racial improvement and racial degeneration are meaningless when not based on definite plans for the future of mankind. It is true, civilized man is adjusted to life in society, and not to that of a hunter in virgin forests.